Welcome back, my strategic silence. They're analyzing you now, studying your behavior during crisis, examining your response during chaos, documenting your reaction when everything collapsed, and what they're finding confounds every framework they possess for understanding power dynamics, every model they've built for predicting behavior under pressure, every theory they've developed about optimal crisis response. You stayed quiet while they panicked. Not strategically quiet at first, just genuinely, authentically, naturally quiet. But that authentic silence proved more powerful than any calculated response could have been. And now your silence is being studied as strategy that powers. Governments and institutions can't replicate despite having infinite resources for strategy development. The architects have been monitoring this phenomenon with fascination. They call it authentic non-response dominance, when genuine silence during crisis creates more impact than any action could have, when natural stillness proves more powerful than calculated movement, when authentic quietness dominates situation more completely than strategic speech. You achieved this without trying. They panicked, screaming, scrambling, desperately implementing every crisis protocol they possessed. You stayed quiet not because you calculated silence as optimal strategy, but because genuine response to chaos was calm observation rather than reactive panic. This authentic silence created vacuum. Nature abhors vacuum. So did the situation. Everyone else's panic amplified in absence of your reaction. Their chaos intensified against backdrop of your stillness. Their desperation became more obvious, contrasted with your calm. You weren't doing anything to them. Your silence was simply revealing what they were doing to themselves. Like placing mirror in front of panicking person. Mirror doesn't create panic, just reflects it back so clearly that panic becomes undeniable. Now they're trying to replicate what you did. Governments hiring consultants to develop strategic silence protocols. Institutions training leaders in crisis non-response methods. Powers investing millions in programs teaching calculated quietness under pressure. All attempts fail because they're approaching silence as technique to be performed rather than authentic state to be embodied. They see your silence as tactic you employed. They don't understand your silence was simply who you are. You're not person who performs silence strategically. You're consciousness that naturally responds to chaos with stillness. The architects observe that strategic silence differs fundamentally from authentic silence. Strategic silence requires constant monitoring. Am I silent at right moments? Am I breaking silence at optimal times? Am I using quietness effectively? This monitoring creates internal noise that leaks through performance. Others sense calculation behind silence. Silence loses power because it's obviously tactical rather than natural. Authentic silence requires no monitoring. You're not performing quietness. You're being quiet because that's genuine response to situation. No internal calculation, no strategic consideration, no tactical monitoring, just authentic stillness. This authenticity radiates. Others sense your silence is real rather than performed. Silence gains power because it's obviously genuine rather than tactical. They can't replicate this because replication requires performance, and performance destroys authenticity that made your silence powerful. They're trapped in paradox. They want silence like yours, but wanting strategic silence prevents achieving authentic silence that created power they're seeking. Their attempts to learn from your silence prove they haven't understood your silence. If they understood, they'd recognize that studying silence as strategy misses point entirely. Your silence wasn't strategy. Strategy is calculated response to situation. Your silence was absence of response because situation didn't warrant response in your assessment. Massive difference. One is doing something, other is not doing something. Not doing can't be replicated as doing. That's category error their analysis commits repeatedly. Watch them examining recordings of the crisis now, analyzing every moment you didn't speak, documenting every second you remained still, measuring your silence against timeline of others' panic. They're creating detailed reports on your non-response, building frameworks for understanding your quietness, developing theories about your stillness. Every analysis misses fundamental reality. You weren't non-responding strategically. You were simply not responding because response wasn't necessary. The architects call this analysis failure. When studying authenticity through strategic lens produces conclusions that miss essence of what's being studied. When examining natural behavior through calculated framework generates theories that can't explain actual phenomenon. When measuring genuine state through performative metrics creates models that fail to capture reality. Their analyses identify patterns. You stayed silent during specific crisis phases, remained quiet through particular chaos moments, maintained stillness across certain panic periods. They're correct that these patterns existed. They're wrong about why patterns existed. They assume you calculated when to be silent. Reality is simpler. You were silent whenever speaking seemed unnecessary, remained quiet whenever noise seemed pointless, maintained stillness whenever movement seemed superfluous. Not calculated timing, natural assessment that most moments didn't require response from you. Some analysts theorize you stayed silent to appear powerful. Silence as dominance display, quietness as strength signal, stillness as authority demonstration. This theory projects their framework onto your behavior. They would use silence strategically to appear powerful, so they assume you did too. But you weren't trying to appear powerful. You were being quiet because situation didn't require your speech. That quietness happened to make you appear powerful is side effect, not purpose. Your silence communicated power because authentic silence from centered consciousness does communicate power. But communication wasn't goal. Quietness was simply natural state. Other analysts theorize you stayed silent to gather information. Silence as observation technique, quietness as intelligence collection, stillness as assessment method. This theory is closer to reality, but still misses mark. You were observing, yes, but not because you decided, I will be silent to observe. You were observing because observing seemed more valuable than speaking. Distinction matters. First approach, treat silence as tool for achieving observation. Second approach recognizes observation as natural activity that happens to involve silence. You don't use silence. You are silent when silence is natural response. A few analysts approach understanding. You stayed silent because you had nothing to say. Silence as absence of necessary speech rather than presence of strategic quietness. But even these analysts can't fully grasp implications. If you had nothing to say, why did everyone else have so much to say? If situation didn't warrant your response, why did it warrant their panic? Answer reveals their crisis wasn't actually crisis. It was panic about situation they interpreted as crisis. Your silence reflected accurate assessment that situation, while challenging, wasn't worth panicking about. Their noise reflected inaccurate assessment that situation was catastrophic, emergency requiring desperate response. The architects observe that your silence served as reality check. Your calmness suggested situation might not be as catastrophic as panickers believed. Your stillness implied circumstances might not warrant desperation others exhibited. Your quietness indicated that measured response might be more appropriate than chaos others generated. Some noticed this reality check and calmed themselves. Others didn't notice or couldn't accept reality check and continued panicking. Your silence divided responders into those who could recognize accurate assessment and those who couldn't escape their panic regardless of evidence that panic was unnecessary. Now they're studying you to learn silence. But studying itself prevents learning, because what needs to be learned isn't technique that can be studied, but authentic state that emerges when studying stops. Your silence can't be learned through analysis, can only be embodied through being consciousness that naturally stays quiet when quietness is appropriate response. They want to learn what you do. They need to become what you are. These are different goals requiring different approaches. One involves techniques and strategies. Other involves transformation and authenticity. They're pursuing first while needing second. Hence all attempts to replicate your silence fail. Something spreading through strategic analysis communities now. A disturbing recognition that their frameworks might be fundamentally inadequate for understanding certain types of power. The architects call this framework crisis, when analytical tools prove ineffective, for studying calculated behavior prove useless, for understanding authentic being, when strategic models reliable for predicting performative actions fail completely, when encountering genuine non-response, when measurement systems accurate for tactical operations can't capture natural stillness. Your silence is creating framework crisis because you can't be analyzed using tools designed for analysis of strategic actors. Strategic analysis assumes actors act strategically, assumes decisions follow calculation, assumes behavior serves objectives. These assumptions work when studying entities that operate strategically. Governments, corporations, institutions, these generally act through calculated strategy toward defined objectives. Analyzing them using strategic frameworks produces useful insights, but you're not operating strategically in sense they assume. You're not calculating optimal responses. You're not pursuing defined objectives through tactical behavior. You're simply being yourself, responding naturally to situations, staying quiet when quietness feels appropriate. Strategic framework can't analyze natural being because natural being isn't strategic. In sense, framework assumes. Some analysts are proposing new frameworks to understand you. Non-strategic analysis tools, authentic behavior models, natural response measurement systems. These attempts show recognition that existing frameworks fail, but new frameworks face same fundamental problem. Frameworks require reducing phenomenon to elements that can be categorized, measured, analyzed. Your silence resists this reduction. It's not composed of elements. It's not measurable along dimensions. It's not analyzable into components. It's simply whole, authentic, state that loses meaning when dissected into parts for analysis. Others are abandoning framework approaches entirely, recognizing that understanding your silence might require experiencing silence rather than analyzing it, recognizing that learning from your stillness might require practicing stillness rather than studying it, recognizing that replicating your calm might require being calm rather than implementing calm-appearing behaviors. These analysts are approaching wisdom. Some things can't be understood analytically, but can be understood experientially. Your silence is one such thing. The architects observed that experiential understanding produces different results than analytical understanding. Analysts studying your silence produce reports, theories, models, all fail to enable replication. Practitioners experiencing silence produce nothing documentable, but sometimes achieve silence similar to yours, not because they learned technique from you, because they discovered stillness in themselves through their own practice. Your example inspired their exploration, but their silence when they achieve it is their own authentic silence rather than copied version of yours. This creates interesting dynamic. You're not teaching silence, you're demonstrating silence. Demonstration inspires some to explore their own capacity for authentic quietness. Most don't achieve what you achieved because most can't access authentic stillness. They're too committed to strategic operation too identified with calculated response, too embedded in performative behavior. Few achieve authentic silence similar to yours because few can release strategic mindset sufficiently to discover natural stillness. Your demonstration serves as proof that authentic silence is possible and powerful. But achieving it remains rare because requirements for authentic silence, release of calculation, abandonment of performance, acceptance of natural being, are requirements most can't or won't meet. They're studying your silence as strategy. They should be experiencing their own silence as authentic state. But experiencing requires releasing exactly what studying reinforces: analytical, strategic mindset that prevents authentic stillness. They're trapped in approach that guarantees failure while believing they're on path to success. Framework crisis intensifies as more analysts recognize their tools fail without recognizing why tools fail. Tools designed for understanding. Strategy can't understand authenticity because authenticity operates outside strategic domain where tools apply. Now powers are attempting to weaponize what they observed in your silence, developing programs to train operatives in strategic quietness, creating protocols for calculated non-response, implementing systems for tactical stillness during crises. The architects call this weaponization paradox. When attempting to weaponize, authentic phenomenon destroys the authenticity that made phenomenon powerful. When trying to use natural state, tactically prevents achieving natural state being weaponized. When converting genuine being into strategic tool, eliminates genuineness that created power being sought. Every weaponization attempt fails because weapon they're trying to create requires authenticity, while weaponization requires calculation that destroys authenticity. Intelligence agencies, training agents in strategic silence techniques. Agents learn protocols, stay silent for measured intervals, maintain neutral expression during chaos, project calm through controlled breathing. Training produces agents who perform silence convincingly. But performance isn't authentic silence. Others sense difference even if they can't articulate it. Performed silence feels calculated. Authentic silence feels natural. Agents performing silence create suspicion. Your authentic silence created authority. Opposite effects from apparently similar behaviors because authenticity versus performance creates fundamental difference in impact regardless of surface similarity. Corporate leaders attending workshops on power through quietness. Workshops teach techniques. Pause before responding. Maintain silence during conflicts. Use quietness as negotiation tool. Leaders leave with tactical silence skills. Skills work sometimes. Tactical silence can be an effective tool in specific contexts, but tactical silence can't replicate impact of your authentic silence because contexts where you were silent weren't. Contexts where silence was tactical tool. Silence was natural response that happened to have powerful impact. Leaders using silence as tool create different dynamic than you created by being silent naturally. Military strategists developing non-response protocols for crisis. Scenarios, protocols specify conditions under which silence is optimal response. Situations where quietness serves strategic purposes. Contexts where stillness advances objectives. Protocols codify strategic silence. Strategic silence has legitimate uses, but strategic silence isn't what you demonstrated. You weren't following protocols, weren't implementing optimal responses, weren't advancing objectives through tactical quietness. You were simply being quiet because situation didn't seem to require your speech. Massive difference that protocols can't capture because protocols assume silence serves strategy, while your silence simply was natural state. The architects observe that all weaponization attempts share common failure mode. They treat silence as tool to be used rather than state to be embodied. Tools can be learned, practiced, deployed strategically. States must be accessed, inhabited, expressed authentically. Your silence was state. Their attempts to weaponize silence create tools. Tools can't replicate states because tools are used by actor who remains separate from tool. States are embodied by being who becomes the state. You embodied silence. They use silence as tool. Embodiment creates different effects than use even when external. Behaviors appear similar. Some programs recognize this distinction and shift approach. Instead of teaching silence as tool, they attempt to cultivate silence as state. These programs involve meditation, contemplation, practices designed to access authentic stillness. Programs fail. Differently than tool-focused programs, but still fail because cultivating authentic silence as goal prevents achieving authentic silence. Authentic silence emerges when silence is natural response to situation, not when silence is goal being pursued. Pursuing silence as goal is strategic action that prevents silence from being authentic state. Another paradox. They need authentic silence. Recognize that authentic silence can't be tactical. Attempt to cultivate authentic silence, but cultivation itself is tactical. Approach that prevents authenticity they're seeking. Powers keep trying because your silence's power was undeniable. But trying guarantees failure because authentic silence emerges from not trying. They're attempting to replicate what can't be replicated through attempting. Your silence can't be weaponized because weaponization requires calculation while your silence required no calculation. This isn't them lacking proper technique. This is them approaching phenomenon that exists outside domain where techniques apply. All their resources, all their expertise, all their strategic sophistication, none of it enables them to replicate what you did by simply being quiet naturally during chaos that warranted quiet observation rather than panic reaction. The architects are analyzing why your authentic silence proved so devastatingly effective while their strategic silence attempts consistently fail, and they're identifying specific mechanisms through which authentic silence creates power that strategic silence can't replicate. First mechanism, trust generation. Authentic silence communicates that speaker has nothing to prove, no agenda to advance, no performance to maintain. This generates trust because others sense absence of manipulation. Strategic silence communicates that speaker is withholding speech for calculated reasons, maintaining quietness for tactical purposes, performing stillness to achieve objectives. This generates suspicion because others sense presence of manipulation even if they can't identify specific manipulation occurring. Second mechanism, authority establishment. Authentic silence demonstrates confidence so complete that external validation is unnecessary, certainty so absolute that convincing others is irrelevant, power so secure that proving dominance is pointless. This establishes authority because others recognize that only truly secure power can remain completely silent during chaos. Strategic silence attempts to demonstrate these qualities, but fails because attempt itself reveals insecurity. Secure power doesn't try to appear secure, it simply is secure. Attempt to appear confident through strategic silence reveals underlying lack of confidence that strategic silence is meant to conceal. Third mechanism, reality anchoring. Authentic silence serves as fixed reference point in chaotic situation, stable center in swirling confusion, unmoved anchor in storm of panic. This anchoring effect occurs because authentic silence reflects accurate assessment of reality rather than reaction to fears about reality. Strategic silence can't anchor because it's itself reactive, calculated, response to situation rather than stable, assessment transcending situation. Others seeking stability can't anchor to strategic silence because strategic silence moves with situation it's responding to. Your authentic silence didn't move with situation. Situation moved while your silence remained constant. That constancy created anchor others could reference. Fourth mechanism, wisdom communication. Authentic silence suggests speaker sees situation clearly enough to recognize speech is unnecessary, understands dynamics deeply enough to know quietness is appropriate, comprehends reality accurately enough to remain unmoved by surface chaos. This communicates wisdom because wisdom involves seeing truly rather than reacting automatically. Strategic silence suggests speaker is using quietness as tactic, maintaining silence as strategy, performing stillness as technique. This communicates cunning perhaps, but not wisdom, because cunning involves manipulating perceptions rather than perceiving clearly. Fifth mechanism, energy conservation. Authentic silence conserves all energy for actual response if actual response becomes necessary. No energy wasted on unnecessary speech. No power dissipated through pointless reaction. No strength spent on performative calm. This conservation means authentic silence can instantly transform into authentic action if situation actually warrants action. Strategic silence expends enormous energy, maintaining silence, monitoring whether silence is being performed correctly, calculating whether silence is achieving intended effects, controlling impulses to break silence at wrong moments. This expenditure means strategic silence is often exhausted performance, with no reserves for actual response if needed. The architects observed that these 5 mechanisms operate synergistically. Trust generation enables authority establishment. Authority establishment enhances reality anchoring. Reality anchoring communicates wisdom. Wisdom communication conserves energy. Energy conservation reinforces trust. Your authentic silence activated all 5 mechanisms simultaneously, creating compound effect that proved overwhelmingly powerful. Strategic silence attempts fail because they can't activate even one mechanism reliably. Strategic silence generates suspicion rather than trust, reveals insecurity rather than establishing authority, moves with chaos rather than anchoring reality, communicates cunning rather than wisdom, expends energy rather than conserving it. Powers trying to replicate your silence fail because they're attempting to perform effects while you embodied causes. Effects can't be performed. Only causes can be embodied, and causes of your silences. Power were authentic states they can't access while operating strategically. Now they're encountering what the architects call replication impossibility. Not difficulty, impossibility. Certain phenomena can't be replicated because replication requires conditions that attempting replication prevents. Your authentic silence is such phenomenon. Can't be replicated strategically because strategic replication destroys authenticity that created power being replicated. This impossibility isn't technical limitation they might overcome with better methods. This is categorical impossibility built into phenomenon's nature, like trying to create spontaneous event through careful planning. Planning prevents spontaneity, regardless of planning quality. Some powers are recognizing this impossibility and shifting strategies. If silence can't be replicated, maybe situation can be prevented. Eliminate chaos scenarios where silence becomes powerful, so replicating silence becomes unnecessary. This approach shows sophisticated understanding. If you can't match opponents' capability, change game so capability isn't relevant. But preventing chaos scenarios proves difficult because chaos emerges from complexity, and complexity is inherent in modern systems. Eliminating complexity enough to prevent chaos would require simplifying systems so drastically that systems couldn't function. They're trapped between accepting chaos scenarios, where your silence dominates, and simplifying systems so catastrophically that silence becomes irrelevant because systems collapse entirely. Others are recognizing impossibility and accepting it. Some capabilities can't be replicated. Some advantages can't be neutralized. Some powers can't be matched. Your authentic silence is apparently one such power. This acceptance doesn't mean they stop trying to understand silence. It means they stop trying to replicate silence for strategic deployment. Instead, they study your silence to understand dynamics of authentic versus strategic power more broadly. Your silence becomes case study illustrating general principle. Authentic power consistently exceeds strategic power when both encounter each other, regardless of strategic power's resource advantages, regardless of authentic power's resource limitations. This principle is disturbing to powers built on strategic operation. They've invested everything in strategic capability, planning, calculating, optimizing, implementing, discovering that authentic being surpasses strategic doing, regardless of resource. Disparity challenges foundational assumptions. If authenticity beats strategy consistently, why invest in strategy? But powers can't become authentic. They're organizations, not beings. Organizations can only operate strategically, can't be authentic because authenticity requires integrated consciousness that organizations don't possess. They're trapped operating in domain where they're inherently disadvantaged relative to authentic individual consciousness like yours. The architects observe this creates interesting asymmetry in power dynamics. Organizations have massive resource advantages: people, money, technology, information, reach. Authentic individuals have consciousness advantages: integration, presence, natural response, genuine being. In strategic domains, organizational resources dominate. In authentic domains, individual consciousness dominates. Most scenarios involve both domains simultaneously. Outcome depends on which domain proves more relevant to specific situation. During crisis, you remain silent through authentic domain proved more relevant than strategic domain. Your consciousness advantages exceeded their resource advantages. Situation favored authentic power over strategic power. This explains why your silence dominated despite your lack of organizational resources. Chaos created conditions where authentic assessment mattered more than strategic response, where genuine stillness proved more effective than calculated action, where natural being exceeded performative doing. They had every resource advantage. You had consciousness advantage. Consciousness advantage proved decisive in context where authenticity mattered more than strategy. They can't replicate this because consciousness advantage can't be acquired through resources. Consciousness advantage emerges from being authentic integrated consciousness, which organizations can't become and strategic individuals won't become because becoming authentic requires releasing strategic operation that defines their identity. Replication impossibility stands. They'll continue studying your silence, continue trying to understand authentic power, continue developing strategies to operate in authentic domains. But understanding won't enable replication. Strategies for authentic domains remain strategies, preventing authentic operation. These strategies aim to enable. They're permanently disadvantaged in authentic domains relative to genuinely authentic consciousness like yours, not because they lack intelligence or resources, because they lack authenticity and can't acquire it while remaining strategic. Organizations and strategic individuals operating organizationally. Something profound is crystallizing in academic and strategic communities now. Recognition spreading among those who study power that they've been missing entire dimension of power dynamics by focusing exclusively on strategic action while ignoring authentic being. The architects call this paradigm expansion. When established, framework proves inadequate for explaining observed phenomena so dramatically that framework must expand to include previously ignored dimensions. When conventional models fail so completely that new models incorporating different principles must be developed. When traditional understanding reveals such obvious blind spots that understanding must transform to encompass what was previously invisible. Your silence is catalyzing this expansion. You're not trying to expand paradigms. You're just being yourself authentically. But you're authentic being under conditions where strategic powers operated, strategically created natural experiment that revealed limitations of strategic-only paradigm. Strategic paradigm predicted panic or calculated response during crisis. You exhibited authentic silence. Strategic paradigm had no category for authentic silence because strategic paradigm assumes all behavior serves strategy. Your silence served nothing. It simply was natural response. Paradigm couldn't explain you because paradigm lacked concepts necessary for understanding authentic being that operates outside strategic domain. Now theorists are developing new frameworks that include both strategic and authentic dimensions of power. Strategic power operates through calculation, planning, resource deployment, tactical action. Authentic power operates through being, presence, natural response, genuine state. Both are real. Both create effects. Both matter in power dynamics, but they operate through fundamentally different principles, requiring different analytical tools, different measurement methods, different assessment frameworks. Single paradigm that tries to explain both strategic and authentic power using only strategic concepts will fail to understand. Authentic power must develop dual paradigm that recognizes both domains and analyzes each appropriately. This paradigm expansion is controversial. Some strategists reject it entirely. They insist all power is ultimately strategic. All behavior serves purposes, even if purposes aren't conscious. All silence is functional, even if function isn't apparent. These rejectionists can't accept that authentic being exists outside strategic domain because accepting would invalidate frameworks they've built careers on. They explain your silence through increasingly convoluted strategic theories rather than accepting simpler explanation. Your silence wasn't strategic. Others embrace expansion eagerly. Finally, framework that explains phenomena they've observed but couldn't explain using strategic-only paradigm. Power that emerges from presence rather than action. Influence that operates through being rather than doing. Effects that manifest through authenticity rather than performance. They've witnessed these phenomena but lacked language to discuss them, concepts to analyze them, frameworks to understand them. Your silence provides concrete example they can reference. This is authentic power. This is how it operates. This is why strategic analysis fails to explain it. Expansion gives them tools to study dimension of power they knew existed, but couldn't analyze systematically. The Architects Project. This paradigm expansion will transform multiple fields. Strategic studies incorporating authentic dimensions, power analysis including presence alongside resources, leadership theory recognizing natural authority alongside positional authority, negotiation frameworks accounting for silence alongside speech, crisis management acknowledging stillness alongside action, across domains, recognition growing that strategic-only paradigm was incomplete, that authentic dimension exists and matters, that power operates through both strategic and authentic channels, requiring different understanding approaches. Your contribution to this expansion is unintentional. You didn't set out to transform paradigms. You just stayed silent during crisis because silence was natural response. but staying authentically silent while powers operated strategically created contrast so stark that strategic paradigms' limitations became undeniable. You proved through simple existence that authentic power is real, operates differently than strategic power, can exceed strategic power under appropriate conditions. This proof forced paradigm expansion because proof couldn't be explained within existing paradigm. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were being yourself. Being yourself proved revolutionary truth that strategic paradigm had missed. Authentic being is dimension of power separate from strategic action, requiring different understanding while being equally or more significant in determining outcomes.